Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. My name is Sean, and today we're going to talk about this, what seemed to me to be a little bit of a controversy about Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, the ultra-woke mayor of Chicago, spending $30,000 in campaign funds on his own hair and makeup that somehow blossomed into a greater controversy when Brandon Johnson played the race card, and that made me want to look into this even further, only to discover that the $30,000 number is very much the tip of the iceberg. In fact, there's all sorts of improper reporting all over this money being spent, and while that number sounds really big, when you realize that they're not even reporting it properly, that is what greets suspicion. Now, we're going to get into this, but before we do, thank you to everyone who signed up over on actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Let me ask you another question. There will be the awkward elephant in the room, and that is about the Sun-Times story last week about your spending of $30,000 from your campaign fund for hair and makeup. Can you respond to that and explain why you think that's an appropriate use of the campaign dollars to many people seems like a lot of money?
I think it's always appropriate to make sure that we're investing in small businesses, especially minority-owned, black-owned, women-owned businesses. Our campaign spends money on food. We support black and brown-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, printing. There are a number of things that my campaign spends dollars on. And I'm so committed to supporting small businesses that even as mayor, we just made another announcement of another $35 million available for small businesses. That's important to people, that we lift up, small businesses that, in particular, that don't always get the attention and support that they deserve it. And so we're going to continue to do that as a city, and we'll make sure that, I encourage all of you in this room, support small businesses. Go get your hair and makeup done by black people in particular.
Chances are, if you've encountered this story on the internet.com, you have encountered it through this particular Q&A exchange where Brandon Johnson is asked point blank about how he's spending the campaign funds, whether or not that's wasteful. And again, $30,000 sounds like very much a lot of money, especially when you consider this is only over a 15-month period, which we'll get into a little bit later in this video. And Brandon Johnson responds by saying that he's supporting black businesses. And honestly, everybody should support black businesses, and when he goes out to restaurants, he also supports black businesses. So honestly, the implication from the mayor is that you're evil, white, and racist for daring to question how Brandon Johnson spends his money on hair and makeup, because that money is going to black businesses, therefore it is noble, good, and virtuous, and again, you're an evil, white racist. Now, this obviously greets more suspicion in my opinion. It welcomes it right in the door, and this caused me to actually look up the initial reporting on this, only to discover that this controversy has a little bit less to do with racism than you imagined, which is zero, so it's actually negative value associated with racism, and a little more to do with very suspicious campaign finance activities from Brandon Johnson's mayoral campaign.
We start here at 5 o'clock with questions about Mayor Brandon Johnson using campaign funds to pay for hair and makeup expenses for himself and other people tied to his campaign. The Chicago Sun-Times first reported that Johnson has spent more than $30,000 in 15 months.
Because contrary to what Brandon Johnson believes, you can't just spend campaign funds on whatever you want, no matter how much you want. There are rules, there are limitations, and there's a legitimate debate on whether or not Brandon Johnson is paying fair market value in order to get his haircut and in order to get his makeup done. So let's go into the original article that did the write-up on this, and you'll see why this is a bit more suspicious than you maybe imagine. So according to Brandon Johnson's latest campaign finance report, it lists a $4,000 payment from his political fund to a Palatine beauty studio on March 27th, and this expenditure says it was for event expenses. Now, hearing that came as a surprise to the owner of that company, Anthony Jones, who said that he never received any of this money and he's never done any work at all whatsoever for the Johnson campaign. In fact, he gave this quote to the Sun-Times. Quote, I'd love an extra $4,000, but we never got any money from him. Nobody from the campaign has ever been in my salon. So again, when you look at the initial reporting, it often jumps to the $30,000 number for hair and makeup. And honestly, we don't know what portion, or at least we didn't know what portion from the local news coverage goes to hair versus makeup. But what we find out right here is that according to the Johnson campaign, they issued a $4,000 payment for haircuts, which seems like rather a lot over a 15-month period for the mayor. But then, interestingly enough, it turns out that the salon that Brandon Johnson reportedly, according to his campaign finance documents, got his haircut at, says that they've never done business with Brandon Johnson, they've never done business with his campaign, and they never received this money, which prompted more questions, more looking into this financial situation, and thus ended up having a response from the campaign that said, oh, our bad, we just wrote down the wrong place for the haircuts. Our mistake, we misfiled the report. Totally not suspicious at all. Don't ask questions on why Brandon Johnson is paying $4,000 in terms of haircuts to a barbershop and why we wrote down the wrong barbershop, because it was just a mistake for us to write down the barbershop. And what's interesting about this is that apparently in the city of Chicago, it is very much well known where the mayor gets his haircut. When they asked the Johnson campaign advisor, Bill Neidhart, he said the report was a mistake. Quote, the vendor that does our expenditure reports, we gave them the name of the business for disclosing and filing made to the Illinois State Board of Elections, and they wrote down the wrong one. The report should have shown the money was spent with AJ Styles Barber and Beauty Salon at 664 West North Avenue, according to the campaign guy, who says the mayor's campaign will be filing an amended thing to say so. Now, there's also a quote that says anyone who knows Brandon Johnson won't be surprised that he goes to a barbershop on the west side, right outside Austin. And when we look into this a little bit further, we find out that this barbershop is a couple of blocks down from where Brandon Johnson's original office was when he held his previous position. Now look, if I'm being perfectly fair to Brandon Johnson's campaign, after reading this in article form, I think it's actually a fair mistake. The salon that they wrote down was called the Anthony Jones Beauty Salon, and in reality, what they meant to write down was AJ Style and Salon, and people could have easily assumed from hearing AJ, if you punch this into the Google machine, especially with the way that certain companies have different names on the corporate end than what they present to the public, that these were one in the same place. So fair enough, obviously, but that still begs the question why Brandon Johnson is spending $4,000 on getting his haircut.
Last August, when we spoke to Mayor Brandon Johnson in a one-on-one interview, his makeup artist prepped him before we asked questions. Johnson is paying his makeup artist through his campaign donors. Likewise, this hair salon in Austin is also paid with campaign funds. It's just 3 doors from his former county commission office. Johnson has expensed more than $32,000 from January of 2023 through the end of March of this year. Campaign records show the makeup artist was paid $28,000, the hair salon $4,000.
But that wasn't the only suspicious portion of it, because what we also found out is that Brandon Johnson has spent the rest of the $30,000 at a makeup person who is actually somebody who works out of their home, and this is supposedly for various campaign events, although I will point out that it still seems like a lot of money based on the events that are listed right here. So we're going to go over the major expenses, and I'm going to tell you where all the money is, in my opinion, for said expenses. So we have candidate makeup for TV, again, makes sense. Candidate makeup for debate, again, makes sense. Then we have candidate makeup, and then we have makeup retainer. So this is just an amount of money that's supposed to come up for a bunch of different things. And then after Johnson took office last year, he continued to pay this person, although this has been explained only as event expenses.
The key is the law does not prohibit expenditures for grooming expenses, and it is absolutely clear that how you look is at least as important as what you say in any political situation.
Now look, to be clear, doing the hair and makeup, especially for people who are going to appear on TV when they're campaigning and when they're doing events as a candidate and all of that, it makes sense to either pay that out of your personal account or to pay that out of the campaign funds, because like it or not, the way a candidate looks, obviously that has an impact on how they're going to be perceived, and that has an impact on the campaign. So to a certain extent, these expenses are justified, as long as, according to Illinois law, you're not paying above fair market value for this, and this is related not to your personal grooming, but related to your role as a candidate, because campaign funds, unsurprisingly, are for the campaign. However, there have been stretches in that. There have been other things that this has been applied to before. Very notoriously, we had Congresswoman Cori Bush, who is paying for her security detail out of her campaign funds, although that's not the best example, because it turns out she hired her boyfriend, who then became her husband, and then hired a real security firm on top of that to actually do her security. So we have seen suspicious transactions like this from the Democrats, but again, the only thing that brings my attention to the sloppy reporting and the amount of money that Johnson is spending is the fact that he tried to cloak this behind saving the black people, supporting the blacks, and all this race-related stuff, because he's a one-trick pony, and guess what? He needs to perform.
I would be hard-pressed to say grooming is part of your governmental functions. That's not a function of government to look good.
Bert Olson is an attorney who specializes in election law.
Now, you guys will probably recognize this particular attorney because he's going after Tiffany A. Henyard for improper spending. He's actually investigated corruption in the state of Illinois for now about 30 or 40 years, so he's seen it all, because Illinois is the state with the most corruption prosecutions of any state in the union, and he says that this doesn't seem legitimate. And again, while I can say that this is related to you being a candidate, you getting your haircut, the fact that you're spending $4,000 on this doesn't make any sense. But it appears what's going on is that the Johnson campaign is also paying for, out of the campaign funds, other individuals to have their own personal grooming needs taken care of. And this maybe comes close to the $4,000 that he was spending on haircuts. At first, I thought that maybe this was going to be $1,000 on haircuts, which still seems like a lot over a 15-month period. But again, I'm not somebody who's in the political eye in terms of being in office, so I get my haircut a normal distance of time apart from one another every 6 weeks or so. Brandon Johnson, being a candidate, might do something crazy like every 2 weeks, although $4,000 still seems very expensive, again, post being elected, for you to be doing that. But, whatever. I don't know. Maybe he's a generous tipper with people's campaign funds. But what I find interesting about this is that we have some precedent. We actually have previous mayors, their previous campaign reports, and luckily enough, we have women as previous mayors in the city of Chicago. So obviously they do make up more often, not just for TV. So one would expect for us to see somebody like Lori Lightfoot have more expenses on hair and makeup than someone like Brandon Johnson. And this is where things get even worse for the mayor.
During former Mayor Lightfoot's term, she expensed $8,000 total for hair and makeup to her campaign funds.
If I was to pick a side here, I'd pick a side of being on the conservative side, following the letter of the law, and not trying to stretch the law.
The campaign money was used.
Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that a very fascinating data point to compare to the current mayor, Brandon Johnson, who spent $32,000+ on hair and makeup in and around a year, compared to his predecessor, Lori Lightfoot, who is nowhere near my favorite person in any way, shape, or form, spending $8,000 total throughout her whole entire term as mayor, expense to the campaign on the same. And I just want to point out that Lori Lightfoot actually ran for mayor in the city of Chicago twice, because remember, she ran in the campaign where she won the mayor's office, and then she ran again where she lost, didn't even make the runoff that allowed Brandon Johnson to come to office. But she still, in all of that time, only spent $8,000, while Brandon Johnson is billing 4 times as much in 1 year, so he's on pace to absolutely shred her with 16 times the number of expenses on hair and makeup for a man as compared to a woman on hair and makeup, and the reason why is because he's getting it done for everyone. Now look, whether or not this is actually illegal, like the more conservative attorney said earlier on in this local news segment, remains to be seen. That's not really the issue at hand. The issue at hand is how politicians, and a lot of times we're talking about politicians who are Democrats, disproportionately progressive Democrats that promise to fight back against campaign finance corruption, spend your money. Brandon Johnson obviously does not give a damn about his campaign donors. What he does care about is funneling that money to his friends who operate as vendors in what is clearly and obviously, in my opinion, a scam, a kickback, a payoff to people that are connected to Brandon Johnson in order to provide these goods and services to him. And they're not even smart enough to actually expense this right, which again, that improper filing is one of the things that drew attention to this, even though I would say, as somebody who doesn't know either barbershop, it's an understandable mistake, considering Brandon Johnson has gone there ever since he worked in that office that was 3 blocks away from there. You would think that he would have this on point and his campaign team would have this on point. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. So those are just my opinions. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Is Brandon Johnson perfectly valid, and are you a racist for questioning why he's spending so much money on hair and makeup, not just for himself, but for other people that he knows? Or is this obviously some kind of weird kickback, or at least him overspending on luxuries for members of his staff at the expense of his donors? Or maybe is this something related to him knowing who's in charge of these businesses? All your comments down in the comments below. As usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Brandon Johnson spending a lot of money on hair and makeup, especially considering he's a dude. Till next time.